Moving on, now we're going to talk about these subcategories of how many rule. So as we said earlier, in an autocracy, we have one person ruling. And so a monarchy, the key difference, the main difference between a monarchy and a dictatorship is how they get their power. A monarchy, power is inherited. And when we say inherit, we mean it comes from their family. And usually it comes from, I'm going to focus that a little bit, maybe. It comes from there, that's better. It comes from their parents. So in a monarchy, you know, if you have a king and the king dies, who gets to be the new king? Well, it's the king's son. And that's what we inherit, is something you might inherit your grandma's pie safe, or you might inherit some land that's been in your family for years and years. Inherit is something that's passed down to children after the parents die. In a dictatorship, though, power is taken by force. So somebody goes in, takes over. You know, like Fidel Castro in Cuba, or there's a dictatorship in North Korea, I believe. And let's see, who else have been famous dictators? Attila the Hun. Hitler is a famous dictator, but interestingly, Hitler he got elected to leadership, but then he kept his power by force. He didn't let anybody vote him out then. So that's when he became a dictatorship. He kept it by force. He didn't take it by force. An interesting thing, though, about a dictatorship and about these definitions is that a dictator takes power by force, but often dictators then, when they get ready to die, who becomes the next dictator? Well, it's their son. So they pass it on by inheritance. So at that point, it's not a dictatorship any longer. It's a monarchy. They might not call it a monarchy, but the key difference here is how their power is gained. It's either inherited or taken by force in a dictatorship. Okay. One other thing that I want to point out is that there are two different kinds of monarchies. And we have absolute monarchy. An absolute monarchy means that the ruler has absolute power, no limits on power. Of course, a dictatorship always is always absolute. There's always no limits on a dictatorship. But an absolute monarchy has no limits, and there are not very many absolute monarchies left in the world. At the time of America's Revolution, there were a lot of absolute monarchies. Whatever the king said went. The other kind of monarchy is called a constitutional monarchy. And a constitutional monarchy is limited by, guess what? A constitution. Limited by a constitution. And so typically, a constitutional monarchy is a mixed form of government, and it's sort of mixed in with, let's just put this little arrow from here. It's sort of mixed in with a democracy. So democracies typically have constitutions that limit the power of the government. And so Great Britain today is a constitutional monarchy. They have parliament, they have a prime minister, but they also have, right now they have a queen. Eventually they'll have a king. And so the role of the monarch is much more limited in a constitutional monarchy than in an absolute monarchy. Okay, so autocracy means one person rules, and so typically that one person can do whatever they want. There are no limits. We'll talk later about what does that mean for the people that they're ruling. But right now we're focused on who is ruling. So let's move on and talk about oligarchy. And what is the difference between an aristocracy and a timocracy? Well, in an aristocracy, power is inherited. Imagine that. And so we often call this the nobility. So like dukes and earls and barons and marquises, and I can't think of any more words, but they're usually rich, but there's several of them, and so they each have their own area that they rule, but then they'll come together to make decisions for the whole country. But whoever the duke is, when he dies, his son becomes the new duke, and so that power is passed on by inheritance. In a timocracy, you guessed it, power is taken by force. And so this is usually the military of the country or the police force of the country. And I'll give you a little clue on how I remember this. It might not help you very much, but it helps me. My husband's name is Tim, like Timocracy. Tim Pulley is his name. And I don't know if you know what he does for his job. He's a highway patrolman, so he's a policeman. And he's also in the Army. He's a colonel in the Army. And so either one of these could work for him. So if a bunch of him and people like him took over, we would have a timocracy, power taken by force. All right, oligarchy. There are very few oligarchies because the people in these groups, they start fighting for power, and eventually one of them takes over. And so we end up with either a monarchy or a timocracy. So I'm just going to sort of draw arrows over here. So a lot of times this is what happens. Oligarchy doesn't last very long. Okay, let's see. That's 7 minutes. So we are going to pause right there. Again, what I recommend for you is that you take a break. Maybe look this over really good. And then when you come back after a few minutes, on a separate piece of paper, hide this, see how much of that mind map you can draw from memory. This is the best way to help you actually remember all these relationships and how these words relate to each other. Okay, next time we will be